He didn't book seat 14C for comfort. He booked it so the pain wouldn't win this time. The aisle meant he could stretch his left leg a little, not a luxury, but a necessity. There's a difference. Though people forget that, Harrison Ford wasn't recognized. That was good. Or at least, it saved him from having to explain why someone who once flew helicopters over burning mountains now needed 3 careful steps just to ease into a plane seat. The tan jacket helped him blend in. The limp didn't. He sat down slow. One hand gripped the headrest. The other pressed flat on his thigh, coaxing the joint. His knee clicked softly as it folded. Just once, but it lingered. He exhaled through his nose. Finally. The air smelled like overly sweet detergent and coffee no one had asked for. He didn't mind. He just needed the aisle. That was the whole point. He'd barely fastened his belt when she appeared, clipboard, tablet, navy blue scarf, looped just so. She wore authority with the kind of smile that didn't bend. "Excuse me, sir. Are you seated in 14C? He glanced up. "I am." She crouched slightly. That practiced grace flight attendants use when they're about to say something you won't like. "We have a family with 3 small children who got separated during booking. Your seat and the 2 beside it are the only block we can use to keep them together." He didn't answer right away. His eyes went past her, to a woman in the front of the cabin, 1 child in her arms, 2 more hanging onto stuffed animals like shields. He nodded once. "That's tough," she smiled, maybe assuming that meant yes. "I actually booked this seat months ago," he added. "Extra leg room. Bad knee." His voice stayed level. "From a crash. A long time ago." "I understand, sir," she replied, without pause. "It's just that, if we can't reseat you, the family might not be able to board, and we may not be able to close the cabin doors." Ah, the pressure, not spoken like a threat, but laid down like a folded napkin, crisp and polite. He didn't like being the reason a flight got delayed. That's how people stared, and he could already feel eyes on him now. He hesitated, not because he was undecided, but because part of him wanted, just once, to stay seated. He stood. It wasn't graceful. His hand caught the seat in front of him. The joint barked. He winced, barely. Then he looked at her. "Steady. Make a note, will you?" he said. "I'm not giving this up. You're taking it." She blinked, just for a second, then nodded. "Of course." He didn't look back, just picked up his bag and started walking toward the back of the plane. Seat 32B was waiting. "Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe." Seat 32B wasn't just in the back. It was the back, tight row, middle seat, the kind where elbows touch before thoughts even do. Harrison paused at the aisle, gave a small nod to the guy in 32A college age. Headphones. No eye contact, then squeezed in. 32C was already claimed by a man with a tablet and a suit jacket folded too precisely across his lap. Neither offered help. He didn't expect any, but still, the overhead light was flickering, one of those half-hearted stutters that made it feel more like interrogation than illumination. The air back here was thinner, somehow stale, laced with bleach and something sweet trying too hard to cover it. He sat down slowly, carefully. The knee bent, not willingly. The seat creaked, and nobody looked, not even a glance. He placed his small duffel under the seat ahead. The handle stuck out just a bit. He nudged it with his foot, then winced. Wrong leg. For a few seconds, he just sat there not moving. Eyes closed, jaw tight. No one noticed. The businessman beside him was already typing. Fast, something aggressive about it, like he was winning an argument no one else got to hear. The kid in the window seat chuckled once at something in his earbuds. Didn't share. Harrison adjusted in his seat, just a little enough to try and give his knee some room. There was none. His left shoulder brushed the man beside him every time he breathed too deep, so he stopped doing that. He glanced toward the front. He could still see the top of the mother's head. 3 rows up. She was getting settled now. unwrapping crackers, murmuring to the youngest. No eye contact. Didn't expect that either. The plane began to fill. Flight attendants moved past like flowing fabric. The curtain between economy and first class snapped closed with a soft woof. That sound always made him think of old parachutes. Then something slipped from his inside jacket pocket, barely a whisper as it fell. A folded piece of paper, yellowed at the crease, skidded to the floor between his shoes. He bent slowly, picked it up. It was a topographic map, torn from an old field journal. Handwritten in one corner, North Wash, Liam. He stared at it for a moment too long. Across the aisle, a woman in her 40s noticed, neat blazer, watching him over the rim of a paper cup. She didn't speak, just noticed. Harrison tucked the map back into his jacket. Then, almost under his breath, still remember, kid. No one heard, or maybe someone did, but the seatbelt sign chimed, and that was louder. Captain David Miller had just settled his headset into place when the notification pinged. He glanced down at the console. Nothing urgent, not weather, not fuel, just a soft red flag on the internal crew dashboard. Passenger concern escalated Delaney, Ford seat 14C reassigned. Medical note, VIP tag. He frowned. Tapped into the record. The details were vague, but the name, Harrison Ford. He blinked. Not the actor well. Yes, the actor. But that wasn't what made his pulse pause. Back in '98, Miller had been an aviation cadet, doing a rotation out of Moab. A rescue came over the wire. Solo civilian pilot brought out a teenager who'd broken his femur deep in Canyonlands. Night landing, no lights, no backup. Ford had flown in alone, got the kid out. It was one of those stories that passed through pilot circles like wildfire. Some details blurred, some exaggerated. Maybe. But the core was real. And now he was in 32B. David sat back in his seat, glanced at his co-pilot, who was halfway through checklist recitation. Hold position, David said quietly. The co-pilot stopped. We're clear for taxi. I know. Give me a minute. He unbuckled. Stood. You okay? David didn't answer right away. Just adjusted the stripes on his cuffs and stepped out of the cockpit. Not in a rush, but with purpose. He didn't know exactly what he was going to say, just that he couldn't fly this plane knowing the guy who once pulled a bleeding kid from a canyon at midnight was wedged in the middle of economy like a forgotten jacket. He passed a few rows. Passengers were still boarding. There was chatter, bags clicking into overheads, a baby already fussing. And somewhere in the motion, subtle but steady, the atmosphere shifted. Charlotte Hayes noticed first. She saw the captain pass row 18, then 24, heading back, not forward. No smile, no announcement. That kind of movement meant something. Back at 32B, Harrison had leaned his head against the wall, eyes closed, one hand on his knee, breathing shallow, like he was counting seconds instead of taking them. The reading light above him blinked again. He didn't bother opening his eyes. And then a voice. Not loud, but direct. Mr. Ford. He opened his eyes. The captain stood there, perfectly still, shoulders squared, hat tucked under one arm, a half-beat of silence, then a salute, precise, formal, and somehow personal. Sir, the captain said, voice low but clear, on behalf of Transcontinental Airlines, and maybe a few others you've helped along the way, I'd like to say I'm sorry. Harrison didn't speak. He just looked at the man, and something in the air just for a second felt heavier than altitude. The cabin went quiet, not silent, not yet, but quieter. The kind of hush that rolls in when something unfamiliar steps into the ordinary. Captain Miller didn't rush. He walked the narrow aisle like it was solid ground, like every step meant something. He passed row after row passengers, tracking him with the kind of half-curious, half-anxious glances people give authority when they're not sure whether it's about them. He stopped at row 32, didn't speak right away. Harrison sat upright now, still silent, still unreadable. A calm that felt learned, not natural. "Mr. Ford," the captain said again, softer this time. Harrison looked up. "I believe this was a mistake," the captain continued. "You should not have been asked to move from your seat." There was a pause. Harrison's eyes narrowed slightly, but not in anger, more like he was sorting something internally. "Didn't think that was your call to make," he said. "It wasn't," the captain replied. "Not officially." Another beat. Then, the captain shifted slightly, barely noticeable, and extended his hand. "Please," he said, "come with me. Seat 1A is open." It wasn't a request so much as an offering. Harrison didn't move. Not at first. He looked at the captain's hand, then past him, toward the curtain that separated this end of the plane from everything up front. For a second, it looked like he might say no, or at least question the point. But then something shifted, a flicker behind his eyes, a weight maybe loosening or being rearranged. He nodded once, slowly, tried to stand. The man in 32C moved aside awkwardly, muttering something about not realizing and sorry. Harrison didn't respond. The college kid pulled his headphones down, blinked, the same blink you give when you realize someone you ignored mattered. Captain Miller didn't let go of Harrison's arm until he was steady. Charlotte watched all of it, still didn't speak, but she sat a little straighter. They started walking up the aisle, not fast, not slow either, just steady, and row by row. People turned, not because they were told to, but because something about the moment felt worth turning toward. Harrison didn't look at any of them. His gaze stayed just ahead, not proud, not shy, just present. The curtain to first class was already being pulled aside. A flight attendant waited near the front, the same one from earlier. Kayla. Her face was pale now, the practiced smile nowhere in sight. Captain Miller turned toward her. "Ms. Bennett," he said quietly, "please escort Mr. Ford to seat 1A. She nodded, almost whispered it. "Yes, Captain." Then stepped back. Harrison paused at the edge of the curtain, and then without a word crossed through. Seat 1A looked too clean, wider, sure, leather instead of cloth. The window shade pulled halfway down, like someone left mid-thought. But it wasn't the space that made Harrison pause. It was how wrong it felt. He stood there for a moment, not moving, as if stepping into it too soon might undo the weight of everything behind him. Captain Miller leaned slightly toward the flight attendant, the same one who'd moved him earlier, and spoke just above a whisper. "If it's occupied, we ask. If not, we honor the move." Kayla nodded. She looked smaller now, less polished, but 1A wasn't empty. A man in his 40s sat there, polo shirt, business casual, the kind of traveler who printed his boarding pass an hour too early. He was sipping from a water bottle. Looked up, puzzled. Kayla cleared her throat. "Sir, I'm sorry, but we need to reassign your seat. The captain is requesting." The man cut in, still confused. "Wait, what captain's requesting?" He turned toward the aisle, saw Harrison, froze. He didn't blink. His expression changed all at once, confusion folding into something else, something far from annoyance. "Oh my God," the man said quietly. Harrison raised an eyebrow. You're the guy from Tahoe, 1995. You flew the Long Ranger in solo, my brother." His voice cracked. "My brother was the one trapped near Dead Horse Point. You pulled him out." Silence now. Not dramatic, just complete. Harrison didn't respond immediately. His face didn't change much, either, but his eyes did. Just slightly. "You were there?" he asked, voice a little rougher than usual. The man nodded. "He didn't stop talking about you. For years, we never knew your name. Just the pilot." Harrison exhaled, not quite a sigh, more like the release of something he'd been holding in his chest. "I thought That kid didn't make it. He did, the man said. He did because of you. He stood up without being asked. No hesitation this time. He stepped aside, gently, like offering something sacred. Please, he said, it's yours. Harrison stepped forward, not proudly, not reluctantly either. Just quietly. He sat down. The seat didn't feel wrong anymore. Not because it was comfortable, but because it meant something now. Something different. He looked once at the man still standing near the curtain, then gave a slow nod. Tell your brother, Harrison said. I'm glad he made it. I will. The man didn't return to first class. He slipped back behind the curtain. No fanfare, and Harrison for the first time on this flight let himself lean back. The silence around him had changed. It wasn't cold anymore. Seat 1A felt different now. Not softer, not more spacious, just quieter. Harrison rested his palms on his thighs. The leather was cool under him. His leg appreciated the stretch, but the pain had already settled into its usual spot just behind the kneecap, like a shadow that never quite left. He didn't close his eyes, not fully, just lowered his gaze. Watched the tiny movements of the cabin. A napkin straightened, a tray returned, a seatbelt clicked somewhere behind him. The kind of details you only notice when you're trying not to think, but memory has its own timing, and it didn't ask permission. The air had been dry, high altitude sharp, dust curling upward in small gusts as the rotors slowed. Harrison had stepped out first, boots crunching over loose shale. The boy's scream had come seconds later, echoing off canyon walls, cracked open with panic. He'd made it to the edge of the drop just in time to see the older brother trying to hold on, knees bloodied, hand wrapped around a tree root that looked more thread than anchor. Don't let go, Harrison had said, but he had. Not the older one, the younger. Liam. The kid slipped. Just like that. He hadn't even screamed. They pulled up 2 minutes later with the older brother shaking, covered in grit, alive. But Harrison hadn't gone back to base with them. He stayed. He stayed and searched for hours. Not to find the boy they knew that was done, but to find something. Anything. His jacket, a shoe, a piece of a name. He'd found neither. Just wind and silence. And the guilt that arrived right on time. A soft chime brought him back. Someone in 2C asked for a glass of water. The flight attendant nodded, walked away. Harrison let his eyes settle on the pocket inside his jacket. He didn't reach for it, not yet, but he felt the crease of the paper inside the same map. Torn, folded too many times, still legible. North Wash, Liam. He didn't know why he'd kept writing it. Every time he transferred journals, new notebooks, new pages, the name always found its way in the margins. Not for remembering, for something else. Maybe penance, maybe proof, or maybe because some things didn't want to leave. He leaned back, not far, just a few inches. Enough to breathe, enough to be still. The man who'd recognized him, the one who gave up his seat, hadn't said thank you. Not directly, but somehow, that made it land harder. It wasn't about gratitude, not anymore. It was about being seen for what you carried, for what you lost, and maybe, for once, for what you tried to save. The hum of the engines settled into a low, steady murmur background noise that somehow made the silence sharper. Harrison sat still. He hadn't touched the water bottle on his tray, or the blanket someone had quietly tucked beside his armrest. He hadn't unbuckled his seatbelt either. Even though the sign above had dimmed, he just sat. Then a soft crackle, the sound of the intercom warming to life. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Miller's voice came through. Calm, precise, not scripted, not rehearsed. I'd like to say something before we take off. A pause, maybe longer than necessary. No music, no flight attendant announcements overlapping. Just him. Earlier, a decision was made on this aircraft that shouldn't have been. One of our passengers, Mr. Harrison Ford, was asked to give up his seat. Another pause. You could feel the air change again. He didn't raise his voice, didn't push back. He just moved. A longer pause now. But what most of you didn't know, what we didn't know at the time, is that Mr. Ford is more than just a name. Years ago, he flew rescue missions that saved lives. In some of the most dangerous conditions imaginable, he didn't wear a uniform, but he showed up when others couldn't or wouldn't. There was no murmur from the cabin now. Even the babies had stopped. Today, he was quietly displaced to accommodate others. We understand families traveling together is important, but so is recognizing someone who spent his life helping people. He didn't owe a thing to. Another breath, this one audible, and we failed to do that. Harrison stared forward, unmoving. His jaw flexed once, but that was all. Captain Miller's voice softened, but didn't lose weight. I want to be clear. We don't leave our own behind. Not in combat, not in wilderness, not at 30,000 feet, not when they need a seat. Someone in the back sniffed. Just once. If this flight leaves a few minutes late, the captain continued, I'll take every one of those minutes with pride. There was a click, the mic shut off, and for 3, maybe 4 seconds, nothing happened. Then one clap, not forced, not loud, just a single pair of hands. Then another. Then a third. The applause didn't swell. It rolled slow, deliberate, like something rising that had been held back too long. Harrison didn't look around. He didn't smile. He just nodded. Once, barely. The kind of gesture a man makes when something inside something old finally exhales. He looked out the window, where the last light of day was still catching the wing, and the plane, at last, and began to move. The plane landed without fanfare. A gentle touch to the runway, a low whir of reverse thrust, and then the slow, familiar crawl toward the gate. No one applauded this time. No whoops, no cheers. Just the soft thuds of overhead bins popping open and seatbelts snapping free. Harrison stayed seated. He always did. He'd never liked the rush to stand, to crowd the aisle like the world was going to leave without them. And now, after everything, he had less reason than ever. He watched people shuffle past, not hurried, but hushed. A few nodded to him. One woman rested her hand briefly on the back of his seat, didn't say a word, then kept moving. Kayla, the flight attendant, stood near the front. She caught his eye once. There wasn't a smile, not quite, but she gave a small nod. Maybe it meant sorry, maybe just, I saw you. He nodded back. As the last passengers cleared the aisle, Harrison rose slower than before, but not hesitant. The ache in his knee reminded him it was still there, but didn't argue as much. He stepped through the threshold of the plane like a man exiting something more than just aluminum, and the jet bridge was quiet, cooler than he expected. Somewhere further ahead, families reunited with arms wide. Suitcases thudded to the floor. Hugs overlapped with tears and airport chatter. He didn't hurry. Near the far end of the corridor, just past the baggage claim signs, a young woman stood alone, crisp white uniform, hair neatly pulled back, hands gripping a poster board that read, Welcome Home, Grandpa. When she spotted him, her posture broke. Not in a clumsy way, just enough to let her face fill with something raw. She ran. He didn't flinch. He didn't brace. He just opened his arms and let her hit him full force. Your knees, she said, already pulling back. But he held her a moment longer. They've had worse, he smiled. And I've never missed your graduation. She stepped back, finally looking him over. Her gaze landed on his chest. His jacket was still buttoned, still clean, but his eyes. Something was different. You okay? She asked. He looked past her for a second toward the arrival hall, where life was resuming at its usual pace. People waving, people forgetting. Then he looked back. I had a bad seat, he said simply, and someone stood up. She blinked, didn't quite understand. but nodded anyway. They walked together in silence, matching pace despite the limp. Harrison didn't talk much on the way to baggage claim, but he didn't avoid her questions either. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a story was chasing him. Not guilt, not memory, just presence. The envelope was plain. No logo, no dramatic return address, just his name handwritten, not printed, and the corner smudge of a postal worker's thumb. Harrison stared at it a moment before opening it. His fingers were careful, slower than they used to be. He didn't rip it. He peeled it open the way you would a note someone took time to write. Inside was a single sheet, typed, "Dear Mr. Ford, your actions on flight TC-306 were brought to our attention by a passenger advocate and corroborated by several witnesses. We apologize for the mishandling of your reservation and the discomfort it caused. You have been issued a full refund. More importantly, we've added you to our permanent Veterans Honor List priority seating included. But this letter isn't about policy. It's to say we saw what happened, and we remember who you are." There was no signature, just Transcontinental Airlines Veterans Council. He folded it once, placed it on the small table in the front room beside an older envelope unopened, still sealed from the National Park Service. He hadn't opened that one in years. Next to it sat the field map, worn at the edges, creased along Liam's name. A breeze nudged the curtains in the kitchen. The house was always quiet this time of day. No traffic out front, just the sound of dust settling where no one walked. Another envelope came the next afternoon, smaller, hand addressed again. This one, he opened slower. Inside a photograph yellowed at the corners. A boy, maybe 12, in a neck brace, giving a weak thumbs up from a hospital bed. Scrawled on the back, Tahoe, 95. He wouldn't stop talking about the man in the sky. And beneath that, a short message. Handwritten, "We blamed you for not getting there sooner. What we didn't know, what he finally told us is that you were the only one who came. We owe you more than a thank you. We owe you our son." There was no name. Just still grateful, still remembering, always. Harrison didn't cry. He didn't really do that anymore. But he sat back, hands resting on his knees, and let the silence stretch long and wide. He didn't look at the picture again right away. He just stayed with it, the weight of it. Not sorrow, not exactly, just something fuller than regret, something warmer than forgiveness. And for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like he was carrying it alone. He reached for the map, unfolded it, and slowly, with a steady hand, added a second name just below Liam's, not for remembering, for returning. The sun was setting when Harrison stepped onto the porch. The light didn't spill across the land the way it used to. It crept now, cautious, like it understood the cost of getting too loud. He settled into the old wooden chair, the one with a barely there lean to the left. Didn't rock, just sat, one hand on his thigh, the other resting lightly on the folded map in his lap. He didn't open it right away. There was no ceremony in moments like this. Just air, and weight, and quiet. Inside, the house held on to shadows. Not the cold kind, just memory. The letter from the airline still sat on the table. So did the photo. Neither moved. He'd left them that way on purpose. Out front, the gravel road didn't carry many cars, just the occasional engine hum. Mostly, it was wind now, and birds that didn't ask to be noticed. He finally unfolded the map. Carefully, Liam's name was still there, marked in the canyon where everything had started. And now just below it, a second mark. Smaller, but bolder, in a different kind of ink. Caleb, alive. He stared at it for a while. No expression. Not blank, just full. Then he reached for a pen, not to add another name. Just a word. Underneath, both, not alone. He sat back again. Let the wind shift his collar. Let the sun warm the back of his hand. He didn't hear the screen door open, but he felt it. A neighbor boy, maybe 10, maybe 11, stood at the edge of the porch. shy, holding something rolled under his arm, a newspaper. The front page wasn't bold, but the headline sat clean across the top: veteran honored mid-flight captain stops plane for a rescue pilot long forgotten. There was a photo, grainy, side angle. Harrison, seated in 1A, looking out the window. The boy held it up awkwardly. "Is this you?" he asked. Harrison looked at him for a long moment, then back at the paper. He gave the faintest smile, more in his eyes than anywhere else. "Sometimes," he said, "when it counts." The boy nodded, didn't ask more, just handed over the paper and left the way he came quiet. Quick. Harrison set the paper aside, didn't open it, didn't need to. He looked out across the hills. The map still sat in his lap, and this time, when he closed it, it folded easier than it ever had before. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.